Hello and welcome to another exciting new episode of Light in the Darkness, where we talk about critical thinking. And today we're going to be talking about a topic.
Is that your lead-in for me? Oh my God.
Yes, I was waiting. This was your cue.
We're going to be talking about a topic today, and the topic we're going to be talking about is logical fallacies. And we're going to split this into several videos because there's lots of different types of logical fallacies. We don't know how many videos because we're worried that, who knows, we could get stuck on one logical fallacy and talk for a long time. So we shall see. I've grouped them into 3 different categories, so we'll see if they stayed grouped in those categories. But we're starting today with logical fallacies. What are logical fallacies? They are errors within argumentation, logical errors within argumentation, so that then the evidence or the argument that is presented has logical errors or flaws, which then obviously weaken the argument, or sometimes you can have a logical fallacy and the argument is still okay, but it just weakens the argument. But for a lot of cases, the logical fallacies actually disprove or completely contradict what is trying to be proven. So I guess you should keep that in consideration, that just because something has a logical fallacy doesn't mean everything is completely wrong. You don't throw it out the window completely. Is that the wrong to say, Stephen?
No, I think that makes sense. I mean, it's also sometimes a bit of it can be an academic matter, I think, when it comes to logical validity in a truly formal logical sense. I mean, you can have all kinds of things like if Wednesday is green and the Pope sends me flowers, then I become a dog. I mean, theoretically, you could make an entire statement that is logically completely valid, but of course has no meaning in the real world. So
yes. So logical fallacies don't necessarily completely destroy an argument. It doesn't mean that everything within that argument is wrong. It weakens it, but yes, in some cases, it does completely destroy the argument. Also keep in mind that a lot of these fallacies are overlapping and tie into one another. So often when you're committing one fallacy, it can lead into a second. And obviously some things that you come across and read can have multiple types of fallacies in it. So very rarely I find it'll just be one fallacy. So today, how I've grouped them is fallacies in terms of evidence, how evidence is presented or how evidence is used within an argument. So the first one that we're going to talk about is the straw man. So a straw man is when someone misrepresents, exaggerates, or completely fabricates another person's argument to make it easier to attack. So it's called a straw man because it's metaphorically, you're taking the substance out of something to make it easier to knock down. So literally picture a straw man in a field and how flimsy they are, that you have taken out the substance of an argument to make it easier to defeat. Either, yes, by misrepresenting it, exaggerating, or by outright fabricating what someone has said. Do you have any good examples of strawmen or where you see strawmen happening most commonly?
I find this one often demonstrated in politics. I feel like politicians have a very nice tendency to completely misrepresent their opponent's arguments and then make it seem like they themselves are very clever by countering that.
Yes. It's been a couple times now when I've taught this. It's aligned with a Canadian election, either provincial or federal. And it's been great because we just then watch the candidate debates and we'll find all these fallacies. Yes. So strawman is one of them where you misrepresent it. I find too that strawmen can sometimes be very difficult for a reader or listener to recognize because you then need to have some knowledge of whatever argument they are misrepresenting, exaggerating, or fabricating. So this one can be really dangerous because we as readers may not know that someone is creating a straw man if we haven't come across or been exposed to that original argument that they're breaking down. I don't know. Do you have any tips of things that people could do to combat this? Oh, you froze. Can you hear me? Are you
You're
there?
back.
Oh,
Yeah.
I froze. I'm sorry.
You froze. But what we should point out at this point was that you were merely demonstrating what it would be like to be a straw man.
Yes. Yes. But you're frozen.
It was all
so you're probably stronger than a straw man because you're frozen in place, harder to knock over. What was the last thing I said? What did I say? Were you listening to me, Stephen?
No, I was not. No, I because it was a couple minutes, and then, oh, well, not a minute, but it was a while, and then I thought, what do we do now that you're frozen?
Damn. Did you hear the part where I said it can be really hard to recognize a straw man?
Yes.
Yeah. So then.
Because you don't have the argument necessarily as the listener or the reader. That yes.
Yeah. So would you, Stephen, have any tips for people of how to recognize straw man arguments? What are ways that we can then try to circumvent this?
Yeah, that's a really good one, because I often actually find that difficult too. I would say that the simple adage of, if it sounds too good to be true, then it might very well not be true. So if it sounds like someone is making a very powerful argument for something on the basis of what someone else is purported to have said, then I would really like to know. I would want to see what that person said in the first place. So I would try to look for that quote, interview, whatever medium that is, probably.
Yeah. Always go to the source. I feel like a broken record because I say that all the time. Like, see if you
but
can
it's
go
an important thing that people don't often do, I find.
Yeah. I think one way you can combat this, which maybe isn't something people want to hear, is, especially when it comes to politics, because again, I teach this a lot of times during campaigns, is, well, then you need to educate yourself on what the policies actually are of all the different parties, because then you will never know how accurate the arguments are being made against them. Then you'll never know if it's a straw man or not. Which takes a lot of work, but there you go.
But this is how you become, like, none of this is easy. The whole process of critical thought is not something that comes naturally. If it would be that easy, then everybody would be doing it, but people are not. Yeah. So I think it is important to realize that it's also difficult, and that it is a learning process. It's a skill that you learn and that you have to continuously work on. Yeah.
So I think being well read and being well watched goes a long way to combating being able to actually spot straw men. Yeah. But again, it can still be very hard because it can be done really cleverly. Are you okay if I move on to the second one?
I think so.
So the second I want to talk about is the Texas sharpshooter. This is often tied to the straw man, or I see it happening hand in hand with the straw man, because this can be one method that someone could choose to use to misrepresent someone else's argument, is by doing the Texas sharpshooter. So what the Texas sharpshooter is, so think of it, Texan with a gun. This is you are cherry picking data.
Can you go
clusters.
over this in a Texan accent?
I can't.
Just for the
no,
I tried.
I don't want to offend anybody. So this is when you're cherry picking data clusters to suit your argument. So you'll pick out specific data, or you will find a pattern within that data to fit your presumption. And often this is taken out of context of what surrounds it. Does that make sense to you? Is that clear? Yeah?
I think so.
Do you have an example of this?
Well, one thing that I often use in introductory psychology is condom. Well, no, wait a minute. Let me rephrase that. One example that I often use relates to condom use versus the contraceptive pill.
Yeah.
Which happened because at some point I overheard students talking. I was just like walking through the hallway and heard something about, well, let me see if I have it the right way around. Interesting choice of words, but I think it was about condoms being the most effective method of contraception,
Yeah.
contraceptive method. Um, so this is true. Condoms are a very effective method of contraception, but that depends a little bit on what you look at. Because, for example, if you look at typical use, as most people would use condoms, then it turns out that there still is, like if I want to say something close to a 20% failure rate. So in other
Yeah.
words, for every 5 condoms used, that's one baby, right? Potentially, which is a lot when you think about that
Yeah. It's a lot of
going on in
babies.
the world.
Yeah.
So there is that. So if you look at that, but then you look at it in a broader context, I'm not even going into like where do you get the numbers, because that's a whole different thing. But if you look at that in context, then yeah, they are pretty safe, but there are other methods that are safer, which you then choose to ignore. Like there is the contraceptive pill, or there are all kinds of other things, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Which turn out to actually have, even with typical use, tend to have an even higher success rate. I don't know
Yeah.
if this is a good example, but this is something that would come to my mind.
Here's an example I usually give because I talk about this quite a bit with my students because cherry picking is basically backwards research where you already know what you want to prove. So then you just go and do research and find little bits in that research that already support what you say. And then you take it out of context because it supports what you say. So, for example, I'm currently working on a project that's looking at how depression and anxiety is depicted in picture books. So I have the hypothesis that the terms depression and anxiety are not actually used in those picture books from the literature study I've so far done. And I'm going to talk about the consequences of that. But if I then come across a picture book that uses those terms and I go, oh, this really doesn't fit with my research, let's just not include this within the data, that would be me then cherry picking and deciding I'm not going to include that because it doesn't fit the presumption that I've already come up with. So it's literally just choosing what you want to use because it already supports what you're saying or supports what you're trying to disprove, but you're not taking the full context.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. Can I move on?
Sure.
So then tied to this as well is the appeal to authority, which we've already kind of talked about or touched on. But again, I find that with the Texas sharpshooter, some ways that people will cherry pick information is by calling on the wrong kinds of authorities or taking sound bites out of context.
Yes.
So an appeal to authority, there's kind of two ways that this becomes a fallacy. The one is if you use an opinion of an authority in the place of an actual argument. So you're just using a soundbite rather than making an argument. Or, which we've already talked about, you appeal to the wrong type of authority as proof or as evidence. So again, you've broken your arm and you come to me because I have a doctor in front of my name, but I'm the wrong kind of doctor to help you with your broken arm. So that would be an appeal to authority fallacy because I'm the wrong kind of doctor in that instance. Do you have any examples of appeal to authority?
No, I actually I think that's a good example, and especially given that people have all kinds of doctorates at all kinds of different levels and all kinds of different things. I'm a psychologist, and that means that in certain ways I'm supposed to be able to say something about people's mental lives, for example. I happen to not be a clinician, but imagine I would be a clinical psychologist. Then my field overlaps with that of a psychiatrist who has an actual medical degree. But a psychiatrist can prescribe medication and I cannot. So if I would, as a clinical psychologist, talk extensively about all kinds of antidepressants, say, then you could expect a clinical psychologist to know something about that. However, that was not as substantial a part of that degree as it would be in the case of a psychiatrist. Plus, even a clinical psychologist, no matter how much he or she knows about it, is not allowed to prescribe those drugs. So for those kinds of opinions, I would be careful. And you see that a lot now in this specific era and time, that all kinds of people who are quote unquote doctors, and I don't mean that in a judgmental fashion, but are doctors in certain fields, have extensive opinions on, say, coronaviruses. So I
Yeah.
don't know if a chiropractor really has a whole lot of input that would be as valued as, say, a virologist would have on coronavirus, which is not a dig at chiropractors, but it's just, I don't think that is the right type of doctor for that purpose.
So this basically comes to misusing ethos, right? Like you're misusing the wrong kind of expertise to try to bolster your argument, which again can
Yes.
be part of the cherry picking or the straw man. I find this happens a lot within our mass media when it comes to celebrities. That I read this one paper um, that was making some good arguments, but they were making arguments about the effect of social media use on teenagers' self-esteem. Fine topic. But then the first expert or authority they brought in was this quote from Vince Vaughn, the actor, about his thoughts on him thinking it was ruining teenagers' self-esteem. He is not a psychologist. He has not done studies. He's perfectly like capable to have that opinion, but to then bring in that actor as an authority to help back up your argument is the wrong authority figure to use. And I mean,
Yes.
later on, they did bring in examples of psychologists that have run studies, like participant studies with young people, and so better. But bringing in Vince Vaughn to back up your argument is maybe not the best authority figure to use.
No, and in a something that I find fascinating, and this is getting slightly off topic, so I won't make this a long point, but I find that we now live in a society where the opinions of actors, singers, social media influencers are, I think, valued more than people who have who actually have a degree in that specific field,
Yeah.
and that I find quite concerning at times.
Yes. So again, beware the soundbite. Beware the
Yes.
soundbite, especially if it's coming from, and again, celebrities. They're free to their opinions, as we are all free to our opinions, but then don't use that soundbite as proof for some kind of argument when the expertise is not behind it.
Yeah, and I think that this kind of boils down to something you said in one of the earlier episodes. Everybody has the right to an opinion, but some opinions are better than others. I may be
Yeah.
paraphrasing you a little bit here, but I mean, I actually believe that is true.
Yeah.
I mean,
Some opinions have more merit than other opinions.
yes,
So, yeah. I'm sorry, Vince Vaughn, if he's listening.
yes. If he's listening,
He probably
we
is.
send you our apology.
Okay. So then the fourth one I want to talk about is burden of proof. Um, burden of proof. I see this again. I see this all the time in like political debates. I also see this in a lot of, if you ever, I don't know, go to a bar with grad students and they start arguing, the burden of proof comes up quite a bit when they just don't want to have evidence for what they're saying. Anyway, so this is saying that finding proof or evidence lies not with the person that's making the claim, but with someone else to prove them wrong. So if I'm making some kind of argument about UFOs, I then say, I believe UFOs exist. It is up to you, Stephen, to prove me wrong. You have to find the evidence.
Yes.
So the proof is taken off me, the person making the argument, and then is put on someone else. So that's the burden of proof. I had a really funny example, but do you have an example?
No, why don't you give your example, and we can talk about it more.
Okay,
Now I
so
want to hear the funny example.
This is I didn't come up with this. This is from someone else, but I thought this was quite funny. So this is a burden of proof. So Bob declares that the teapot is, at this very moment, in orbit around the sun between Earth and Mars, and that because no one can prove him wrong, his claim is therefore a valid one. Right? So
Nice.
with burden of proof, you can say anything, and then just be like, I'm right until you can prove me wrong. That's the burden of proof.
I think this applies to a lot of sects, for example, right? But the cult leaders a cult, maybe I should say, more than a sect, who then claim all kinds of things, but when confronted, then it's often turned into, yeah, well then prove it, or prove that I'm wrong, do it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's up to you to prove me wrong rather
Yeah.
than. Wouldn't that have been great if you like walked into your PhD defense with that kind of attitude? Here
Yes.
it is.
Yes. You figure it out. Yeah.
You figure it out. You find the
Yeah.
proof.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Anything you want to add?
No, I think what something that I find a good guiding principle in a lot of this reasoning, and this is something that ties into a lot of the things we've talked about, but it definitely also ties into fallacies,
Mm-hmm.
is a statement from my boyfriend Carl Sagan. It was and he, this goes back, like the other people said this and he kind of refined it, but it's often summed up as ECREE, and that's a nice way to remember it. So ECREE, pronounce it any way you like, but extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, right? I can say that I have been visited by 5 aliens last night and that they abducted me, and I'm not poking fun at anyone, but like, you know,
No.
these
Yeah.
stories, right? We hear this all the time, and they took me to their planet and they experimented on me and they whatever. Well, prove it.
Yes.
Prove it. Show us the evidence, and we will go along with you. But so far, the proof is lacking. I'm not just talking about these kinds of things. This applies to all sorts of things. So if you bear that in mind, is it an extraordinary claim? Well, being abducted by aliens, that's a pretty extraordinary claim in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
That's fine. You can make that claim, but then the burden is on you. Then show us the extraordinary evidence for your extraordinary claim. And this is, again, how science works. And this ties into what we talked about last time with peer review. Your peer reviewers will look at if your evidence, if you have extraordinary claims, it's also extraordinary evidence. If you have other claims, what is your evidence? So maybe that's a good thing for people to keep in the back of their minds.
It is a good thing. I think it's also, I'm not going to go too into this because this will really be a rabbit hole that we'll be lost in. But in a lot of law, burden of proof can be actually quite an insidious thing, especially when it comes to sexual assaults and those kind of things. So in that case, burden of proof sometimes can be a very slippery slope and something difficult. But I'm speaking more in someone within the media, within research, that's asking that, right?
Yep.
Okay, I have one last one, and it has two names. It's either the false claim or the false analogy. So this is presuming a real or a perceived relationship between things means that one thing is the cause of the other thing. And again, I have an example that I didn't come up with, but I think shows a ridiculous example of this. So, pointing to a fancy chart, Roger, Jolly Roger. Roger shows how temperatures have been rising over the past few centuries, whilst at the same time, the number of pirates has been decreasing. Thus, pirates cool the world and global warming is a hoax. So it's finding a relationship between two things and then saying that those things are the cause of the other one without having that research to back it up. You might be able to talk about this one more because I think this is something that happens more within like the scientific realm.
Can do, but won't. Yes, no, I think I can. This is actually very nice. I just did this because you mentioned Roger, because Roger is standing there, but I realized that he was actually not visible. So, no, this is a big thing, right? I think this is the same thing as the holy mantra of correlation does not imply causation.
Yeah.
So last time, one of the things we talked about was the experiment and what an experiment needs to be. It needs to have a control condition. You need to manipulate one of the variables, right? Otherwise, it's not an experiment. Yeah. And very often we do research where it is impossible to manipulate the variables. A simple example, but I think a telling one. Let's say that you're interested in the effect of, and this I pick this as an extreme example on purpose. You're interested in the effect of alcohol on fetal development. Well, then obviously you cannot go to an expectant mother and say, here, bottle of Jack, go ahead and then see 9 months later what happens. Completely unethical,
Yes.
This would never be, no one would want to do this, right? In their right minds anyway. So then what do? Well, then you can look at correlations, and this is a whole set of statistical techniques, but basically you measure two things. Say alcohol intake in the mother during pregnancy, number of like volume or number of glasses or whatever, and let's say something else. Let's say intelligence in the child when you can test that, or some sort of aptitude test, whatever. We can correlate those two things, and that will give you an indication of how those variables are related.
Mm-hmm.
However, the important factor there is that you have not manipulated anything. And if you look at something as broad as, let's stick to intelligence, well, for sure, maternal alcohol intake will have a negative effect on a child's intelligence. We know this, it's been shown many times. But there are many other factors that could influence a child's intelligence, maybe socioeconomic status, maybe as a result of that, nutrition, maybe education in general, maybe whether or not the child was stimulated to read or not. You could, right now, we can probably come up with a dozen or 20 or 30 factors that could all influence intelligence. But because you never really measured that, or sorry, you never manipulated that, you just measured it, it would be false to say there is a causal relationship. So in this case, it is likely. But let's look at something less likely. There's a well-known, powerful correlation between shoe size in children and their ability to read. But of course, it would be really weird if their shoe size caused their reading ability, right? Yeah. So there is something we call, just to show that we are kind of snobs, tertium quid, the third variable.
Yeah.
How about age? If a child is older, it has bigger feet, it has more experience reading, more reading training, and therefore that is why it reads better. So in this case, there's a whole third variable that you never measured. You never directly measured that, but that is the real cause of that correlation between two things that you found. And that is why we love experiments. Yeah. And that is why you have to be very careful, because often journalists do not fully understand that distinction and then present a correlation as if it is a causation.
Yeah, I'm seeing that a lot right now with a lot of the COVID reporting on both the effects and the possible causes of, I think, that third, fourth, fifth, all the other. But yeah, I like that you brought that up, because usually there's a third, something else missing. Those two do not actually have a perceived relationship.
Yeah, and it's fun, right? It's always, this is something that I always do with the students, like spot the third variable. There's a powerful correlation known between numbers of ice creams consumed and number of deaths by drowning. Well, why? Well, because when it's warm out, people eat more ice cream and they go swim more. So of course, that it's the temperature that is the variable. So you can look at a lot of these things. And this too is something that's kind of hard initially, but that becomes easier the more you think about it.
Yeah, because a lot of times, like the example I gave, obviously was a ridiculous one, but a lot of times, the perceived relationship will seem quite rational and make sense. That, oh yeah, maybe that did. Like the one example that I hear a lot that I ended up saying is, I've been on a plane and then I get sick the next day, and I assume that it's because I was on the plane that I got sick. So I'm making that analogy when really I have no proof that it was sitting on that plane that made me sick. There was probably some other factors involved. See, even I sometimes am guilty.
Yeah, but we do this because it is like, indeed, the examples we gave are absurd, but when you see real examples, it can become a lot harder to really distinguish those things. But it's just, again, it's a simple question. Did these people manipulate something or not? If not, then it is a correlation, and then you cannot say that.
Yes. Yeah. See how they relate. All right. Those are all the ones I wanted to look at within group one. So all the evidence. So did the straw man, the Texas sharpshooter, appeal to authority, burden of proof, and false analogy and false claim. And like I said, I think these five that we went over are very closely related. And often when you have one, you'll have one of the other ones also taking place. Anything you want to add?
I think it's great.
Great.
So another beautiful, beautiful episode, 30 minutes, like almost to the dot.
Oh my
So
God. I want to just try to be shorter. I'm long-winded is the problem. Okay.
yeah, I've just accepted it at this point. Like she just talks. No, I think it's great because you have to spend some time on this. You cannot learn this stuff in 5 minutes. It's too much. So I think this was good. I
Yeah.
haven't had complaints. No one has said that they're too long. So
Now they're going to.
yeah, no, please,
So like
please.
they're like, if all we have to say is to make them shorter, then they're gonna be
Yeah,
shorter.
we have opened a special email address, seehowmuchwecare@gmail.com, where you can send all your complaints, etc. But yeah, no, I think people appreciate it. So
Yeah. Well, everyone keep your eyes open. Let us know if you see any of
yes, that's your
these
homework.
fallacies this week. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. We'll see you again next week with more reasoning errors. What do we call this?
Logical fallacies.
They are still logical. Okay, more logical.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure if they'll be okay. More logical fallacies next week. Bye. Yeah, I clicked stop recording, but nothing happened.